But thank you so much for coming to, I think this is the 9th Grand Dialogue. The Grand Dialogue was started with a grant from the Templeton Foundation. And we're extremely pleased that this conference is also related to the Templeton Foundation in 2 different ways. We planned the conference many months ago because the Kaufman Institute received a significant, nearly $1 million grant from the Templeton Foundation to do an Abrahamic approach to science and religion. It was a project that Kelly Clark, our senior research associate, put together and got funded by the Templeton. And part of that project, and he'll tell you a little more about it, but part of that is to bring 30 scholars from around the world from the 3 Abrahamic religions to explore the questions of science and religion. Each year there's a week-long conference. This year, the week-long conference was held at the Fetzer Institute just outside Kalamazoo. So what a wonderful opportunity for us to bring these scholars to the community. And you'll see on the program, not only is our main speaker part of the conference, but so are the responders, and so are most of the breakout sessions. So what a wonderful, enriching experience, international and interfaith experience for this year's Grand Dialogue.
Doug mentioned that we're doing this in conjunction with a project that the Templeton has funded. It's an Abrahamic inquiry into randomness and providence. And we at the Kaufman Interfaith Institute have been involved in a couple of years of what's called the Year of Interfaith Understanding, because we figured out people can go and we can talk about interfaith. We can get Muslims, Christians, and Jews together and we can talk about it. And what we usually do is say, you know, our religions are really nice. You can repeat a lot of platitudes, and then people go off and nothing much happens. But we figured out if people do things together, so you go to Habitat for Humanity and you build a house together. Muslims, Christians, and Jews sit side by side with, you know, hammers in hand, pounding on nails, and you turn to your friend and start saying, you know, tell me about your family, or tell me about your kids, or tell me about, and pretty soon you're talking, and by the end of the day you've become friends. And it's this joint project that's helped you leave aside for a second faith completely in some ways, but also faith that around the world tends to, or can divide us. Doesn't tend to, but it can divide us. So I dreamed up this project because I thought thought leaders around the world need to get engaged in working together for peace and compassion. And I thought, like, well, I can't get philosophers to build houses probably, but I can get us together and we can work on a project together. And our project is Randomness and Providence. So there's a group of 32 that have met for a week at the Fetzer Institute down in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and we've been talking about these issues together. But we also have gotten to know one another. We've shared our lives with one another. And every participant has agreed that they would spend a week together for the next 3 years, a week each year for the next 3 years. We're not just going to come and talk about ideas. We're going to get to know one another. And I especially was concerned that we would get the younger generation informed and inspired to get issues of interfaith and multi-faith on their agendas for their teaching and their relationships with students and for their own communities. Philosophers, academics aren't rewarded for reaching out to their communities. You're rewarded for writing really generally abstract professional articles and getting them published in journals. That's what you're rewarded for. And so we want to get this on the agenda. So I asked 24 young people to commit for the next 3 years, and the young folks are all going to work together in multi-faith groups and then present our work at the final conference. I'd like all the people who are here to stand who are part of our project. There's 32 people from 14 countries. They're not all here. Some are at the Chabad House, and some had to leave early, but we have 32 people from 14 countries around the world. Thanks for coming, guys. All right, our program proper involves our keynote speaker, Scott Davison. Scott and I go way back. He taught at Calvin College for a while. That's where I met him. And he became a great favorite with my kids. They like Scott, but Scott had rabbits. So Scott, for years, was the rabbit guy. I mean, our kids still say, I say, Scott's coming. He said, they always say, you mean the rabbit guy? And this is from 27 years ago, probably. So, and my kids are considerably older, but they still love the rabbit guy. I was best man in Scott's wedding, and my daughter was in the wedding. And she had this, she was about 4 then, I think, and she had this cute little dress that she says, she'd go around saying, what do you think of my Perky-Winkle dress? It was the cutest shade of Perky-Winkle I think I'd ever seen. Scott's been a great friend for all these years. He also is he's a terrific philosopher, and he's a great speaker. So Doug asked, like, who in our group would be the best to do this? And I couldn't think of a better person than Scott Davison. Join me in welcoming Scott.
Can you hear me okay? Is this working? Can you hear me all right? Thank you, Kelly. How do you follow that? I am deeply grateful to everybody who's organized our events this week. You know, Doug Hinchy and Kelly Clark, the Templeton Foundation, the Fetzer Institute, of course, and all the people who are participating in this. It's been a wonderful experience for all of us, I think, terrific. Before I talk about prayer, which is the subject of my recent research, I just want to add something. No, I have stories. I don't want to compete with Kelly's stories. She does a great job talking about Professor Plantinga. I also was privileged to study with Professor Plantinga, and I just wanted to add that although he's known all over the world for his intellectual achievements, he's incredibly kind and supportive person. And to many of us, he was like a father, like the father we never had.
Speak up, please.
I'm trying my best. Sorry. For many of us, he was the father we never had. Thank you. When I was in graduate school at Notre Dame, in my first year, they wanted to create a promotional photograph to advertise the philosophy program. And they gathered together some graduate students, as you can see here, some of whom became fine philosophers in their own right, except for the shady guy in the back who never amounted to anything. I never did trust him.
He had more hair than.
He had more hair than, too. But it was a delightful privilege to study at Notre Dame with Professor Plantinga, and I'm just grateful to have an opportunity to be part of this. And thank you, Al. Just about a month ago, my book was published by Oxford Press 2 months ago in the United Kingdom about petitionary prayer, and that's the topic I want to discuss today. This is a philosopher's talk. I could mention the fact that you could purchase my book at Oxford's website, and I could share with you the author discount code because it's quite expensive. Or I could point out that you could buy it on Amazon.com if you're a Prime member. But that would be inappropriate advertising, and I wouldn't do any of that here. It would be taking advantage of this opportunity. I won't do that. I don't encourage my friends to buy the book unless they're philosophers because it's very abstract and very expensive. But I want to talk about some things that are in the book today. You know, as a Christian philosopher, I find myself sometimes playing two different roles. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing the role of the coach, where I'm trying to help people navigate ideas in a practical way. And sometimes I feel like I'm playing the role of the referee, who's just sort of explaining, this is how I see it, these are the ideas, this is how they relate to each other. Today I'm playing more the role of the referee than the coach. And so my message about petitionary prayer is sort of fragmented and in some ways disappointing and maybe not very helpful, philosophical in that sense, but designed to provoke thought and to help us to try to think about prayer in a different way. It's just some of the things that I talk about in the book. I'm going to address these questions here, and we'll have a couple of responses after, which will provide a different perspective on prayer, and I think it'll be helpful for our discussion. So I'm looking forward to hearing about your thoughts on prayer. I think the Grand Dialogue is a terrific event, and it's delightful to be a part of it, especially in this capacity. Where I grew up in Ohio, there was this Baskin-Robbins ice cream chain. I don't know if you know about this, but they advertise that they always have 31 flavors available to choose from. I like to remind my students there are 31 flavors of Christianity, at least. You know, and I've discovered this week there are 31 flavors of Islam and 31 flavors of Judaism also. Mine maybe is number 32. I don't know. So, you know, when we talk about these things, we can't help but reveal some of our assumptions theologically, and I will talk a little bit about Christian teaching, but we have to be sensitive to the fact that we have some theological differences. Of course, in this short time, I will just be skimming the surface of some of these issues because it's a very big and complicated set of questions that come with petitionary prayer. I tried to organize the questions in my book and sort of sort out the literature. My book, I think, is the best book-length philosophical discussion of petitionary prayer in the entire English language because it's the only book-length philosophical description of the issues in the English language. I'll hold on to that title as long as I can. Okay, so let me start with a story. Exactly 2 years ago, I was with my father-in-law, recently retired Reverend Donald Clapp from LaGrave CRC here in Grand Rapids, and we were camping up in the Sylvania Wilderness. You know the Sylvania Wilderness? If you're from Michigan, it's up here in the UP, you know. So it's a very remote place, and I have 3 children, but my middle child is the most adventuresome, and he wanted to go. I'd been before several times. He wanted to see what it was like. So in this wilderness camping, you know, you put all your stuff in a canoe, you cross a lake, you drive 12 hours up north to get to this place in the middle of nowhere, and you bring all your things across the lake, and then maybe you go and carry it all in portage to another lake and camp somewhere else. So we were in a really, really remote place. And he was 14. No, he's 12. 12 years old at this time. He's 14 today. About 2 years ago, he was in the tent, and I told him, we're going to go fish. We'll be back in a little bit. We came back. He was gone. Absolutely gone. And so we looked for him. We hiked to the next campsite this way. We hiked to the next campsite that way. We couldn't find him. An hour passed. It was getting late, 5:30, 6 o'clock. I started thinking about it. I remember at lunchtime, he didn't have anything to drink, and I was worried. What if he's dehydrated? You know, where did he go? We waited, we worried. We tried everything. I ran out of things to do. I didn't know what to do. I called 911, and they said, yes, this is serious. We will send help, but you're in Sylvania. It'll take us 2 hours to get there. It'll take us an hour by canoe to get to your campsite, and then, you know, maybe we can look, you know. And it wasn't clear how they were going to look or what good it would do, and I thought by then it's going to be late. And I imagined him sitting in a tree, unable to respond and not knowing where to go. And so I began to pray. I ran out of things to do. I began to pray for a safe return. What else could I do? I had nothing to do. And so I also texted my wife back home in Kentucky, and I said, I'm sorry, but I've lost our son, and I don't know what to do except ask you to pray for his safe return. So I sent her that text. Well, about a half hour later, he comes walking back to the campsite. He had hiked in a direction where he found a beach where there were some pointy sticks, and he was playing with those and having a good time. Like I said, he's the adventuresome one. And so when he came back, he was not alarmed. He knew where he'd been the whole time. Nothing was wrong, you know. And I said, where were you? I told you we were fishing. He said, no, I didn't hear that. I was asleep. So he didn't know we'd gone fishing. He came out of the tent and figured, maybe we portaged to the next lake. I'll just go see if I can find him. So in his mind, he was never in danger. Everything was fine. In my mind, the world was falling apart, you know. So I texted my wife again. Don't worry. It's okay. We found Andrew. All is well, you know. And I called 911 and canceled the help. And then my wife is not very good about checking her phone. It's kind of notorious that if you want to reach her, you should really call me. And so I sent her a third text because she hadn't answered the others. It's a good thing you never check your phone because you would have been in agony like me for the last hour, you know. It was a long day. So was Andrew's safe return an answer to my prayer? Yeah. If I hadn't, this is going to be a good discussion. I can see this. I need to get out of the way. If I hadn't prayed, would it have made a difference? Would Andrew? Would Ed still be out there? Yeah. So this is kind of the main question that I'm trying to address. So a common assumption that I want to gently question here is that every time I pray for something and it happens, then God has answered my prayer. And I want to push a little bit on that assumption. See what you think about the way in which I push on it. Okay. So I'm not saying. I don't want to deny some other things. For instance, I want to say that in some way God is the cause of all good things. I want to say that. And I want to say also that we should always be grateful to God for good things, even if we don't know exactly why they happen. And in the case of Andrew, I was, of course, very grateful for his safe return, right? But I do want to question the claim that every time I pray for something and it happens, then God has answered my prayer. Okay, so that's my question. There are lots of different kinds of prayer, of course, as you know. I don't have all the types up here, but, petitionary prayers, when you ask God to do something, there are other kinds of prayer. Prayers of praise and adoration and confession, prayers of thanks, prayers of lament. And I can't talk about all the kinds of prayer. I want you to remember that there are lots of kinds of prayer, and that when you're told to pray, you're not always told to pray in the petitionary way. I'll come back to that later. Okay. When you talk about petitionary prayers, they have certain components or parts. I talk about this in the book a little bit more detail. But you can think of them as having three ingredients. There's the petitioner, the one who makes the request. There's the thing requested, which I like to call the object. And there is the act of the petitioner requesting the object, the offering of the prayer, you might say. Now, these petitions could be general or they could be specific. They could be specific in the sense like, please return my son safely to me. Or they could be general as in, thy will be done, right? They can also be public or they can be private. In my case, my prayer was private. I didn't say any words, But we have public prayers also where people express publicly a request to God. They could be prayers for other people. They could be prayers for yourself, or they could be prayers for something to happen. So there's a lot of different kinds of petitionary prayers, and you can draw even more distinctions if you want to. In the case for the rest of the talk, I have in mind, for the most part, a situation where I'm asking for something that has to do with somebody else. That's the kind of case I have in mind, but there are all these other cases too. So that's the kind of thing I'm imagining talking about, but trying to speak in a general way about this. Why should we ever pray in the petitionary way, you might ask? Well, if I draw on my Christian tradition here, I can illustrate some of the reasons. This is a verse from St. Paul in the book of Philippians. It's a well-known verse. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. When you look at this, you can see a number of reasons people might have to pray in the petitionary way. Obviously, you're told to pray in the petitionary way. We trust the tradition to tell us the right thing to do. We are also opening ourselves to God. We're sharing our concerns, right? C.S. Lewis, a famous Christian thinker, whom I'll discuss later, says that God already knows everything, but the way in which he knows it sort of depends on us. He might know everything in virtue of being omniscient, but when I turn toward God and volunteer my requests, my information, my needs, then it changes the situation, it changes the relationship I have with God. So I make myself known to God in a way that I wasn't known before. Also, we might think we are influencing God's action in the world. We might think that prayer makes a difference. We might think that if we don't pray, things could go differently. And that was the question that prompted the different answers over here a moment ago. And that's what I'm going to focus on for the most part. But also, obtaining the peace of God. Notice that St. Paul doesn't say, pray and God will fix it. He doesn't say that. Right?
Right.
I don't see it. No, he doesn't say that. No, he says pray, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds, right? So there's that dimension to it. And I'm sure you could go on in this direction. There are lots of reasons to pray in the petitionary way. I want to focus on this question, though, about influencing God's action in the world. So that's kind of my focus. The first question I want to try to answer in a precise way is, what does it mean to say God has answered a petitionary prayer? So let me talk about that in some detail. I think people often say things about this that are interesting. People say often, God answers all prayers, but sometimes the answer is no. Right? I'm sure you've heard this before. And I find this a little bit confusing because when I want to ask about what it means to say God answered a prayer, I want to talk about a case in which the thing you asked for is granted by God. So in that sense, there's a terminological issue to resolve. This is the way I resolve it. It's not completely satisfying, but this is how I'll use the words. I'll say God answers a petitionary prayer only if God actually brings about the thing that was requested. In the case of a specific prayer, it's maybe easier to judge that. In a general kind of case, it's harder. But I'll say that God replies to a petitionary prayer only if God responds to it, not by answering it, but in some other way. And so what I would like to say is that God responds to all, or replies to all petitionary prayers, even if he doesn't answer all of them. That's the way I'll use the words. Does that make sense? So when I say answer, I mean the thing comes to pass that you requested. Not just that God says no. Here's an example of this. St. Paul in 2 Corinthians talks about this thing. We don't know what it was. We have theories about it. This thing, a thorn in the flesh. In order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Paul's prayer was to have this thing removed. We're not sure what it was. In my terminology, God replied to the prayer, but he didn't answer it because he didn't take away the thorn in the flesh. So there was an answer of sorts, but the answer was effectively no for this reason. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to look a little more closely in detail then about what it means to say that a prayer was answered. And I'm going to do this with reference to some other cases of requests and answers that are familiar to us. For a request to be answered in general, the offering of the request has to play an essential role in explaining what happened. So there has to be a connection that's not accidental between the offering of the request and the response in terms of providing an answer. So for instance, if I ask my neighbor, this isn't my neighbor, but I just Googled hedges trimming to get a picture. It's a fictional example. I have really good neighbors. I kind of hit the lottery that way. But if I ask my neighbor to trim hedges between my house and his house, and he does trim the hedges in response to my request. If he had not planned to do this, let's say, and says, okay, I will trim the hedges because you asked, that's a clear case of responding to a request. By contrast, if my neighbor and I are not getting along very well, and I ask him to trim the hedges, and he was going to trim them anyway, and does trim them, but is even inclined to not trim them just because I asked, but does trim them, then it's not a response to my request. It's almost despite my request that he trims the hedges, right? It depends on his reasons for doing what he does, whether my request plays a role in terms of counting that as an answer. It's not enough that it happens after I asked. The asking has to play a role in explaining the answering. So it has to come about in part because I requested it. And I can say more about this in detail later if you're interested. I have a very precise way of describing this, but I don't want to burden you with it today. Here's another example. If you're at an airport in China and a police officer shouts at you, "Wei xiang paxia," and you don't know what that means because you don't speak Chinese, but it's very scary because it's a police officer and you're in an airport and you duck. Well, you've just done what the officer told you to do by luck. The officer told you to be careful, take cover. Well, that's what you did. Not because you understood, right? Just by luck. It happened that what the person told you to do is what you did. And that doesn't really count as as answering the request, right? Because it wasn't based on your understanding of what was said. That could happen too. So we have to have some kind of connection between the request and the offering of the request and the reply. And so in the case of God, I want to say the same thing. In order for something to count as an answer to prayer, God must have brought it about in part because it was requested in prayer. That must play some role in God's decision or action. That means that somehow God has to be aware of my prayers before God decides what to do in response to them. How is it possible that God is aware of my request before God decides what to do? Well, different people have different answers to this question. And I'm not going to try to settle this question, but I just want to mention the sort of three main contenders in terms of how people think about this, because they kind of approach it slightly differently. I don't remember why I have that up there. That's okay. So the first account of providence is called open theism. This is a way of describing God's relationship to time and knowledge. And so on this view, the future isn't here yet. It doesn't even exist. And future free choices are not decided yet. So there's nothing for God to know until we make those decisions. And then God learns, along with the rest of us, what we've decided to do. So my prayer for God to bring Andrew back safely, if it was a free action on this view, God didn't know I was going to do that until I did it. He knew it was possible, but until I actually offered the prayer freely, God didn't know on this view. And so God has to wait and see where the fork in the road goes before he knows what to do. On this view, it's a little more complicated to say how God answers prayers because he has to be able to adjust on the fly. He has to be able, in some cases, to intervene in the direction in which things were headed in order to answer some prayers. That's only one perspective, and some people are uncomfortable with that because it means that God doesn't know the future. He only knows what's possible until he sees what happens, and then he knows. But it's gaining traction. It's much more popular than it was 20 years ago. This view is gaining traction on the other competitors. Again, I'm not trying to settle the question about which of these three views is right one. I just want to kind of gesture at them. A second approach is called eternalism, and this picture is supposed to illustrate it. God sees timelessly all of history from eternity, including our free choices, and then he decides from eternity how to respond in the world. God is outside of time altogether. The famous analogy here is from St. Thomas Aquinas, and you can't really tell what this is, I realize. It's a train of wagons. Like I said, I didn't take this picture. I got this from the internet when I Googled train of wagons. And there they are. And so St. Thomas says if you're in one of these wagons, like this one, you can only see the wagon ahead of you and the wagon behind you, but you can't see the whole train of wagons. But if you're up at the top of the mountain looking in the valley up here, from where we are, looking down, you can see the whole wagon train at once. And he says God is like that. God is outside of time, and so he sees everything at once. And this view has certain advantages. It has other disadvantages, but it does explain a way in which God could be aware of our prayers before we make them, and then he could respond from eternity by arranging the world so that it fits what was asked. So in the case of Andrew, it might be the case that God's outside of time and knew that I would pray for his return and arranged things so that he knew exactly where he was going, and then he came home safely on his own. That could be maybe an answered prayer, right? And then the third view is called Molinism, and this is a kind of a complicated one. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but the idea here is that God knows the future in virtue of inferring what will happen based on knowing what would happen in every possible situation. God knows for any person who could be placed in any situation what they would freely choose to do, and then he knows what kind of situations he will place them in, and then he knows what they'll do as a consequence. So there are a number of ways to try to explain the mechanics of this. I'm not really focused on the mechanics of it. I'm more focused on being precise about what it means to say God has answered the prayer. So I just wanted to make clear that there were different ways to go here. All right. Now, when you talk about what God might do in response to prayer, it's important to realize there are certain constraints. Constraints on God, even. So, here are the constraints on God. See, they prevent God from doing things. That's constraints. See? It's kind of a Greek reference there. Zeus's thunderbolt. You can't quite get past the constraints. So, are there constraints? Well, most people have agreed that there are logical limits on God's power. God can't create a square circle or an unmarried, married bachelor. You know, he can't make contradictory things happen. God can't do what's intrinsically evil, even if we ask and plead for him to do that. He can't do that because it's contrary to his perfection. Because God has a providential plan for the world, depending on how you spell it out, there will be things, petitions, that seem perfectly fine to us. God should be able to do this, it might seem to me. But because it doesn't fit with the divine providence and God's plan for the world, God won't answer that. It could be that way. It's hard to say exactly whether providence is specific in a way that would rule out certain things or not. So there are certain constraints on God. In order for our prayers to be answered, based on what we've said, there has to be some kind of space among God's reasons for the prayer to make a difference. They have to have some kind of role to play in explaining why God does what God does in order to count them as answered. So I'll talk more about this in the book, which is for sale at the publisher's website, Amazon.com, but I don't encourage you to buy it, like I said, because it's very expensive and abstract. So on. Okay. I want to remind you that there are lots of different reasons for praying the petitionary way. I just said that there are limits to what God's reasons can be, and that might make you think, well, some of our prayers maybe can't be answered. But of course, that's not the only reason we have for praying in the petitionary way. I'll remind you about that again later. Sorry, there's a little delay between pushing of the button and the granting of the request here. Okay. All right, so I want to... There's a rattle too, and the rattle makes me nervous. You know, it's not good when things are loose. So I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about science and petitionary prayer. And so I want to say something about science and knowledge, and then I want to talk about some studies. There have been some studies on petitionary prayer I think are very interesting for various reasons. And then I'm going to come back to the question of whether we know that prayers are answered. Okay. So science, of course, is not infallible. You know, science is wrong sometimes. Cholesterol is good for you, cholesterol is bad for you, this cholesterol is bad for you, this cholesterol is good. There's an interesting argument among philosophers called the pessimistic induction. It says, well, just about every scientific theory we've ever seen has turned out to be wrong, so probably our current ones are wrong too. It's interesting. But, you know, they're kind of our best bet about certain kinds of things. Science is not completely objective. We know about certain sociological biases in the way science works and the way it's reported. We know there's a bias in favor of studies that have a positive correlation as opposed to ones that find nothing. So it has those kind of limitations. Scientific conclusions change over time. It's still our best source of reliable information about the physical universe. You know, if I want to know what's happening in my body, I ask my doctor because he's trained in medical science. You know, I don't ask my mother. Sorry, Mom. And Mom has a lot to say about that too, but she's not an expert on health. I trust the science. The science is my best bet, right? Scientific theories, of course, are responsible to what we observe, and they're tested relative to what we observe. That's the empirical aspect of science. And science helps us to decide, very generally, whether or not something makes a difference in the world. And this is why people have tried to test petitionary prayer in a scientific way, see if it makes a difference. How do you know when something makes a difference? How do you tease that out from the data? What do you do to check that? Science is our best way of testing things that we can measure. You know, we can't measure everything, but we want to distinguish what happens by coincidence and what things are connected to each other in some real way. Science helps us discover real connections and distinguish those from coincidences. When I was in Little League baseball, when I was in 4th grade, I had psychic ambitions. I thought I might have psychic powers. This is based on books I was reading that were not authorized by any adult person. And so I thought, when I was playing baseball, I got a little better. But you know, at first I was in left field, which is not as bad as right field. But I was in left field, you know, where you put somebody but don't do a lot of damage. And I would be out there waiting for the ball, which rarely came my way, and thinking, I'm supposed to say things to the coach tells you to say, hey, batter, swing. Hey, batter. This chatter, which is probably never effective. But, you're supposed to request, hey, batter, swing. Come on, swing, And that's the role you play when you're in left field. You're supposed to be helping the team. Well, I wasn't impressed by that, but I did think I might have psychic powers. So I thought I'd put those to use on behalf of the team instead. So I did a little study. I thought, if I focused my psychic attention on the batter, I could make the batter swing at a distance, psychically. So I ran a little study, and I had a correlation going there for a while. When I really focused, the batter did swing. And sometimes I tried, and the batter didn't swing, but I thought maybe I wasn't as focused as I could be. Let's run that again, Eventually, of course, it was pretty clear that I did not have psychic powers. Have to settle for natural accomplishments instead. There are people who believe things that are strange and superstitious, and science helps us distinguish whether these are, real connections or just coincidences. And so, coming back to prayer, in order for something to count as an answer to prayer, God has to bring it about in part, at least because it was requested by us. So let's talk about the science of this. There are different ways and different kinds of studies, but the basic controlled experiment divides people up into two groups. And most of the studies of prayer are like this, where you have a group of people for whom we offer special petitionary prayers, and then a group of people for whom we don't, and we try to tease out a difference over time, see what happens, right? Here's a study that involved 990 consecutive patients in a coronary care unit, which is a significant number of patients, right? It was randomized, it was controlled, it was double-blind. The first names of the patients in the prayer group were given to a team of outside intercessors, professional prayer people who were praying for them daily for 4 weeks, and the patients didn't know whether they were in the prayer group or not. There's another study, it's kind of funny, I'll mention it later, it was much bigger, in which patients were told that they were being prayed for. And when the results came in of the study, one of the researchers wondered if it was a good idea to tell them that they were being prayed for, because he worried that some patients thought, is it that bad? They're praying for me now? Like, what about the medical approach? Can we get to the prayer later? Is that okay? But in this case, they were not told. So there was a double blind. The researchers didn't know, the patients didn't know, and there was some slight difference in the recovery of the patients for whom prayers were offered. The conclusion of the researchers was that prayer may be an effective adjunct to standard medical care. But this study is kind of the exception, and when you look at other recent studies, the most recent ones, the larger ones, they don't find any significant correlations between petitionary prayer and patient recovery. In fact, in the most recent study, there was a slightly worse turnout for the ones for whom petitionary prayers were offered. So the scientific evidence doesn't come in very good. I mean, it doesn't seem to show anything interesting in terms of a correlation. Now, what conclusion should we draw from that? Should we decide then that prayer doesn't work because science tells us it doesn't work? Well, if you're like me, I think you should find these studies a little strange and a little weird and a little puzzling. It's not like you're studying the effect of the solar wind or something where there's just some blind force that you want to measure. You're talking about God, right? Talking about God, a person who has a plan for the world. And so I have some hesitations. I have questions about these studies, and I talk about this a little bit more in the book. How do we know that those people in the control group didn't have as many people praying for them as those in the prayer group? Right? I mean, you can't prevent people from praying for others. Can you imagine the scientist who tries to create that study? You can be in the study as long as your relatives don't pray for you. Do you agree? Will you sign on the line? Consent to conditions like that? I don't think so, right? So how do you know you've really got a control group that's isolating the relevant factor? How do you know the petitionary prayers explain the differences, if there are differences, as opposed to ordinary variables that you expect to find between patients that are selected in this way, right? You wonder what the variables are, right? In the ordinary medical study, you sort of know they're all physical conditions, but in this case, it might be different. Also, even if you had a really striking correlation and you had miraculous cures, how would you know that the petitionary prayers made the difference instead of some reasons that God had that were unknown to us? And that takes me off into a different direction. How do you know what the cause was? How do you know that the prayers played the role? Even though there were prayers and there were miraculous recoveries, how do you know that the recoveries were caused by the prayers? So that takes me off into a new question here. When we talk about specific cases, instead of scientific studies of groups, we have people tell us all the time, this person was in this situation, there was a prayer offered, the person got better, right? Specific cases, we probably all know cases like that. Do we know the petitionary prayer is the thing that made the difference? In the case of the prophets of Baal, or Baal, Baal or Baal, I've heard it both ways. Those prophets, you know those bad prophets? You know, in the Hebrew scriptures, there was a showdown with Elijah, right? And Elijah says, I'm going to call down fire to consume my pile of wood, but you try to do that, and we'll see who wins. And I'm going to put water on my wood because that's not going to make a difference. And Elijah prays, and the fire comes down from heaven and consumes. This is a photograph right here of the event, depicting the actual consumption of the wood by fire. And so in that case, we're sort of told this was the difference. The prayer was the difference, right? In our lives, it's not always clear. We're not told maybe clearly in the same way that the prayer was the difference. It's a little less clear what's going on. Answered prayer, does involve God's reasons. But how do we know, do we typically know what God's reasons are? Do we know enough to say that the prayer was playing a role that explains it in a way that means that it's an answer to prayer? So, we have somebody here who's sick, and we have somebody who prays to God and asks for that person's recovery. And then we have God acting on the person, and the person rejoices. That's what we assume is happening in these cases. But do we have access to all the pieces of this to know that that's what happened? That's my philosopher question. The petitioner rejoices as well, right? As the petitioner should. So I'm going to talk briefly here about the epistemology of answered prayer. I'm not going to go deeply into epistemology, but I want to talk briefly about the question, how do we know? And I want to offer a little bit of an argument here that I think is probably right. Sometimes we don't know God's reasons regarding particular events. You might strengthen that. You might say, typically we don't know, or never know, maybe. But I'm content just to say sometimes today. If you look at the case of Job, this is an interesting example, right? Because in the case of Job, Job is a righteous man and prospers, and of course, never discovers that there's this side bet going on between God and Satan about whether or not he'll crack under certain pressures, right? And I always challenge my students when we talk about this, whether or not God wins the bet or Satan wins the bet. After what happens at the end, it's an interesting question. But Job never finds out any of those things. What happens to him is just a string of bad things, right? Which prompts a kind of challenge to his faith, which kind of ends well, maybe, for Job. He seems to think he's in a better place at the end than he was in the beginning. I heard about you, but now I've seen, he says. But in the case of Job, we place ourselves in the position of Job instead of in the position of the reader who knows what's going on behind the scenes and knows God's reasons. If we are in Job's position, we don't know what's going on. We don't know God's reasons at all, right? And we're never told God's reasons. God says to Job, where were you when I made the world? You don't know how this thing works. This is complicated. You don't understand it very well. So I think, we probably are inclined to agree that sometimes we don't know God's reasons regarding particular events. So sometimes we don't know that the offering of a petitionary prayer played a significant role among God's reasons regarding particular events. We just don't know sometimes what role the prayer played. We know the prayer was offered. Believe God heard the prayer. Believe God will respond in some way, but we don't know when the thing happens if the prayer played that role in God's reasons. So if the offering of the prayer doesn't play a significant role among God's reasons, then of course the prayer was not answered, even if the thing came to be. It could have been part of God's plan for the world, whether I prayed for it or not. Right? The prayer might not have made a difference. I don't know until I know what role it plays in God's reasons. And maybe I don't have access to God's reasons, so I don't typically know. Or sometimes at least I don't know whether prayers are answered, even if the thing that I request comes to pass. I think that's fairly modest conclusion. Sometimes we don't know. Unless we have some kind of special information or revelation or confirmation from God, which we may have, but we don't always have, and we may not have been told to expect that either. So the question I was raising was about this claim. Every time I pray for something and it happens, God has answered my prayer. And I was saying, yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's not that I want to deny the idea that in some way God is the cause of every good thing, or that we should always be grateful to God for good things, even if we don't know exactly why they happen. I'm not questioning that either, right? But I am sort of questioning whether we should assume that every time I pray for something and then it happens that God has answered the prayer. Pushing on that a little bit and saying maybe we should be more hesitant about that. There's a fascinating book by an anthropologist, I don't know if you've heard of this, who immersed herself in a couple of evangelical Christian communities for a couple of years and tried to learn how people learned to pray in the petitionary way. And she's not herself a Christian, but she's very sympathetic. She really immersed herself in these communities. And at the end of her book, she says something like, I came to understand how people see God in the world. And she describes the mechanisms of attention and training that help people to see things as answers to prayer. It's a really fascinating book. I recommend it if you're interested. But when you read that book and you think about the mechanisms that are involved in learning to see the world as answers to prayer, it also makes you kind of self-conscious about how you think about prayers for yourself. It had that effect on me. And there are certain things that pull us in the direction of assuming that when we pray for something and it happens, then it was because of our prayer. I think these may be things that we should be aware of and maybe resist a little bit. You know, we tend to assume that we are in the center of things. We tend to assume that everything that happens in the world somehow pertains to us. And, you know, it may be, you know, we have to fight that a little bit. We look for patterns. We look for causal explanations in terms of things we know and control. This is probably hardwired into us. This is probably some kind of strategy that we can't help in terms of looking for patterns and formulating theories in terms of how to control the world. We look for patterns. We look for explanations. And if we pray and it happens, we might think this gives us some measure of control over things we don't normally control. In the case of my son Andrew, as I described, I turned to petitionary prayer when I ran out of things to do. You know, I tried everything that I could do, and I ran out of things to do. The best line in my book, you don't have to buy it now, I'll tell you. The best line in my book, the only one I'm really happy about, is that it says, we don't ask God to pass the salt. Because, you know, somebody else can do that. You know, we ask God for things that we feel like we need help with. You know? Things that only God can do. You might disagree with that. You can talk to me about that. So we do this. We also tend to assume that what we do makes all the difference. You know, that we're probably hardwired that way to try to look for the effects of our actions. And of course, the world is big and complicated and interconnected and also complicated twice. It's really complicated. See, not just complicated. It's, you know, complicated again. So, yeah, that's a lot worse. You know, so. That's a pretty good takeaway for today. And so, you know, we have to keep these things in mind. Our understanding of the world is incomplete and partial at best, despite our best scientific efforts, theological efforts. So, you know, we have to be humble about this. Now, what does this say about Christian teaching and about petitionary prayer? I want to share with you sort of one interesting puzzle from Christian teaching, and then I want to talk about faith, and then I'm going to be done. So, heading into the final stretch here. Of course, not every command to pray is a command to pray in the petitionary way. I mentioned there are lots of types of pray. Pray constantly, St. Paul says. Does that mean ask for things all the time? Or does it mean just be in communication with God in some way, right? Not every command to pray is a petitionary command. Not every reason that's given for praying the petitionary way requires the assumption that God typically answers prayers. And I've mentioned other reasons why we should pray in the petitionary way. And I mentioned this verse earlier, so I won't read it again. We're not told that every prayer will be answered. Right? Now, this is my interpretation. You might disagree with this. I'm going to quote some more things in a minute. even if every prayer receives a reply, some reply or other, we're not told that every prayer will be answered in my sense, in the sense that God will do everything you ask God to do. So here I'm going to talk about a puzzle from C.S. Lewis about prayer. It's a letter he wrote to his local clergy. He said, I've got a problem. I'm worried about something about prayer. Could you help me figure it out? And as far as I know, his clergy never answered. Never tried to solve the problem. And I'm not sure what the solution is. I have an idea of it. It's not a solution that C.S. Lewis himself liked. For some Christians, of course, C.S. Lewis is a very prominent Christian theologian. He might even be seen as a kind of founder of the faith. I thought that was a clever animation. I didn't get the big laugh. I was hoping for a bigger laugh, but that's okay. So here's his puzzle about prayer. He says, look at the teachings of Jesus. You'll see in the Gospels there are two patterns that Jesus recommends when he talks about petitionary prayer. And he calls them the A pattern and the B pattern. The first one is the A pattern involves this idea that you're saying, God, would you do something, but I really want you to do whatever your will is. And you see this in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane before Jesus' arrest, where he's anticipating what will come the next day, and he's saying, I wish this cup would pass from me, but not my will, but thy will be done, right? So there's a request, but it's always bracketed by this kind of idea that, but I'm not sure that this is what's best. I want you to do what your will is, So I'm asking for something, but, I'm going to be happy with what you decide to do. There's a kind of hesitation about the request, And then the second pattern is this, what he calls the B pattern. And here's an example. Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, when Jesus cursed the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go, throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done. If you believe, you'll receive whatever you ask for in prayer. Whatever you ask for. And Lewis says, this sounds like I should ask without saying, thy will be done. I should say, I want this. And if I don't doubt, and if I have faith, that'll happen. That's the pattern of the teaching. It sounds like a very different approach to a request. And Lewis says, I don't think I can pray in both ways at the same time. Like, I can't do it. Like, psychologically, it's impossible. Either I say, thy will be done, which implies a kind of hesitation, or I say, this, I want this. And I'm not doubting and I'm not hesitant, right? He says, I feel a pull in here that I can't resolve. I can't pray in both ways at once. The B pattern, he says, requires a kind of faith that he says, I don't have it. I just don't have it. And maybe it would only come as a gift from God. It's not something I could even generate on my own. And then he wonders, maybe God would give it to me if I prayed, but which kind of prayer would I use to ask for it? Would it be thy will be done, or would it be give me the faith already? I demand the faith. So this is all in his letter to his local clergy. And so Lewis asks, what should I do tonight? How should I pray tonight when I do my prayers? And unfortunately, like I said, they didn't answer. So he was left with his puzzle, and I'm kind of left with the puzzle a little bit too, as I'll explain. There is one way to try to resolve it, and I'm tempted by this. What you could think is, well, maybe that B pattern where you say, with total faith, the mountain be cast in the sea, maybe that involves some kind of implicit qualifier, something from the A pattern, like, mountain be cast into the sea, if it's your will. Right? So then if I always pray according to God's will, if I pray in the confident way, maybe then my prayers will be answered. As long as you pray according to God's will. And if you're really in touch with God's will, you wouldn't pray for something unless it was the right thing. This is what a lot of people say. Now, Lewis himself didn't like this solution. He said, what would we say to a person who prayed in the B way, but whose request was not granted? What would we tell them? We tell them you didn't have faith? What happened? What went wrong there? Right? And he gives this analogy of a parent. He says, dare we say that when God promises you'll have what you ask, whatever you ask for, he secretly means you'll have it if you ask for something I want to give you? What would we think of an earthly father who promised to give his son whatever he chose for his birthday, and when the boy asked for a bicycle, gave him an arithmetic book, and then first disclosed the silent reservation with which the promise was made? Yeah, you can have anything you want, as long as it's a math book, right? Lewis says we would think that father was kind of a scoundrel, I think is the word he uses, something like that. So Lewis himself doesn't like this idea. But I'm sort of tempted by it anyway, because I don't really know how to resolve the teaching. It's a problem for Christians who take the teaching seriously because you want to honor both teachings. So it's an interesting puzzle. Okay, so now, if you're puzzled then, like I am puzzled, I'm reminding you again of the other reasons to pray in the petitionary way. What does this have to say about faith? Well, this is my last topic, and then I'll be finished. I'll have responses. I went a little longer than I wanted to. We started a little later, so sorry about that. There are different kinds of faith, or different accounts of faith, what faith is, right? And I'm not going to give a complete description. Some people think of faith just as belief, or as acting as if something is true, trust in something or someone, confidence, hope. I'm going to talk about faith as trust in God, the person. And I want to introduce to you an account of trust and evidence that's from a philosopher whose name is Geoffrey Cupit. He doesn't have this picture, but it's my picture that explains his view. So he gets the credit for the view, I get the credit for the picture. So the picture tries to show the relationship between evidence and trust. And the basic idea is that when you have a lot of evidence, you don't have to trust. When you trust, it's because you take a risk because you're not sure. That's the basic idea. So if you look at the picture, the dark part indicates the degree of trust. And so the more black part you have, the more trust is involved. The lighter gray part indicates your degrees of evidence that you have, that the person will do what you need them to do. And so the idea is there's an inverse relationship. The more evidence you have, the less trust is required. Does that make sense? And so at the top, if you had 100% evidence, you might think of proof, then trust is no longer possible. You don't trust that person in the sense of trust that I'm using. There's no trust involved at all. It's just you know what's going to happen. But down here you have something we might call blind trust, where you have no evidence at all to think the person is going to do what you needed to do, and yet you still trust. That's blind trust, right? So you want trust that's not blind, I suppose, in general. How does this apply to the case of God and faith in God? If faith involves trust, and we're not sure in particular cases if our prayers are answered, well, go back to my case of the neighbor answering my request. I can show you some different places on the spectrum here. So my neighbor's really reliable, so here's this green line. This is supposed to indicate where the case of the neighbor. When I ask my neighbor to trim the hedges, and he's trimming the hedges, and I'm not worried about him messing up the yard or electrocuting himself or, stumbling on a buried pipe or something, or, ruining my house. I trust him because he's pretty good. He's actually very, very, very good. So there's not a lot of trust involved there. See, there's a little bit of trust because I have really good evidence that he's going to be fine. I'm not worried about it. Now, by contrast, I have these rabbits. I still have rabbits. Now I have 6 of them. They live in my backyard. This is my daughter, Grace, taking care of one of the rabbits. And when I'm out of town, I ask her, will you feed the rabbits and make sure they have water? And she's 11. She's pretty responsible. But, she's 11. And so, she's in school and life is busy. So I'm trusting her. There's a significant amount of trust there that she's going to take care of this business, right? I have some pretty good evidence that she's going to be okay, but there's also a significant degree of trust, much more trust than involved with my adult neighbor who knows how to trim the hedges, right? And then getting even more extreme in the direction of trust, this is my 16-year-old son getting a picture taken for his driver's permit. I probably don't have to say anything else. But, coming home from there, he was driving for the first time, and there's a lot of trust involved there because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's getting better. But there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of trust and very little evidence at the beginning that he's going to be good at this, right? So there's more trust involved there than there was in the other 2 cases, right? That's the relationship between faith and trust and evidence. How does this apply to the case of petitionary prayer? Well, even if you don't know whether your prayers have been answered, we still trust that God hears them and cares about us. Maybe replies in some other way. Faith in God involves trusting God even when things don't go well for us. And I think maybe that's the main point about faith that I want to make. And even if we pray and our prayers aren't answered, even if bad things happen to us, faith involves trusting God even then. even if you can't tell that the prayers have been answered. And even if the things happen that you asked for, because they might not have been answers to prayer. And in the long run, they might turn out to be bad things for you. But trusting God, anyway, would be the right response in terms of faith. So I want to close with another story. Try to get through this. My wife came down with breast cancer about 1.5 years ago, and she went through multiple surgeries, chemotherapy, estrogen suppression treatment, things that people do. She had significant cancer, and this is a picture taken in the middle of her treatment about 1 year ago, I think. I think it was actually before I lost my son in the wilderness, because this is in Grand Rapids. And so during this time, she's well now. Her odds of developing cancer again are about the same as her odds before she ever developed cancer. So we're past all this, and we're very grateful to be past all of this, as you might imagine. But at this time, you can see me clinging to everything that's dear to me. You can imagine. You can see everybody else is happy, but not me. So during this time, we had tremendous support from our family and our friends. We live in a tiny town, and people were falling over themselves to help us. They were bringing food. There were schedules. There was spontaneous food. It was tremendous. Couldn't ask for more support. And we had this. We had our religious friends telling us, we are praying for you. We are praying for Becky to be healed. We are praying for the treatment to work. We are praying for you every day. But we also had non-religious friends. And they would tell us, we are thinking about you. We are sending you positive energy. Whatever that means. We're doing our best. We just want it to be better. And so, in the end, I have to ask, if my religious friends had not prayed for Becky's recovery, would it have gone differently? Would she have not recovered or not recovered as well? I don't know. I really don't know. Am I grateful for her recovery? Absolutely. Do I think God is the cause of all these good things? Absolutely. If my religious friends hadn't prayed, though, would things have gone differently? I really don't know. What if my non-religious friends had not sent me their positive energy? Whatever that is. Would it have made a difference? Would she have not recovered as well? I don't know. I really don't know. I'm grateful for their support, either way, right? And I trust, that with the little faith I have, I trust that, things are going to work out. I don't know that, but I trust. I trust anyway. And so this happened while I was finishing my book about prayer. So that was a very interesting combination of things. And my original conclusion of the book was a little bit different, a little bit less optimistic. I don't say those two things are causally related to each other, but, maybe I'll find that out someday. Anyway, you've been most patient and kind in your attention. I want to thank you so much. Enjoy hearing our responses from the next speakers. It's delightful to be part of this, and thank you so much. Do you want to do?
Our first speaker is an astrophysicist a physicist, not an astrophysicist. He's a very down-to-earth physicist. From Bar-Ilan University, Nathan Aviezer.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm an Orthodox. My name is Nathan Aviezer, which is not important, but I'm an Orthodox Jew, which is important. And therefore, I wish to welcome you with the typical Jewish welcome, Shabbat Shalom. May you have a Sabbath of peace. This is our Sabbath on Saturday. Now, we've just been told that when good things happen, they come from God. Well, something very good happened to me. Some time ago, I was sitting in my office minding my own business, and I got this email from Kelly saying, would you like to participate in this conference about whatever it's called? Well, I didn't know anything about it, but I said, yes, why not? What do I have to lose? And I've come here, and it's been absolutely marvelous. I had a week of talks Orthodox, one better than the other, and now we have this grand hour. And I was invited to speak there. I'm invited to speak here. Kelly, you're absolutely wonderful. You are good. God sent you to me. Now, the fact that I'm an Orthodox Jew means several things. First of all, it means that I believe in God. And second of all, it means that I pray to God. All Orthodox Jews pray 3 times a day, not quite as much as our Muslim colleagues, but 3 times a day we pray a lot. And I'm supposed to tell you what is the meaning of our petitionary prayer. Now, when I tell you something, it's not really the Orthodox Jewish position, because there is no Orthodox Jewish position about anything. We are the same. If there are 2 Orthodox Jews discussing something, you will hear 3 different opinions. So I'm going to tell you my view of the Orthodox Jew. Now, also, this is difficult because I'm supposed to say how is it different from what Scott said, and actually a lot of it is really the same. That is, we pray for God, and that means that we believe that God intervenes in the world. If God didn't intervene, if he was something overall just looking, now what's the meaning of my prayer? I pray for health, I pray for sustenance, I pray for wisdom, meaning that I believe that God intervenes, and if he wants to, he will give me substance, he will give me health, he will give me wisdom. So far, so good. But we believe that this comes in a particular way. It comes in a way which in Hebrew it says, Olam kemino go noheg. The world works according to the laws of nature. That is, what happens when God answers my prayers, I will never know it. And nobody else will know it. For example, say that my wife or my child is very sick. My child needs an operation, serious operation, and now comes something very important, which God mentioned, but he didn't emphasize it. I'm going to emphasize it. When he couldn't find Andrew, he didn't sit down and pray. The first thing he did was call 911 and run around and ask everybody and do everything he could by himself to solve this problem. And then he also prayed. And this is what the Jewish Orthodox religion requests. When my child is sick, I don't go to the synagogue and pray. I seek the best medical help. I go to the best surgeon I do. It is my obligation to try to solve my problem as best as I can. And then, in addition to that, I pray to God. So the operation, I go to the surgeon and he tells me that there's a 20% chance of the operation being a success and 80% chance that your son will die. So I pray that he should work out. And then it turns out that my son survived, the operation is a success. And then I can ask, was it due to God? And the answer is, I will never know. But I may believe it's due to God. And I tell this to the surgeon, who is a complete atheist. He says, what are you talking about? I told you 20% of the patients survive. I'm a top-notch surgeon. You should see when you get my bill, you'll see how good a surgeon I am. And therefore, your child survived because I did. So who is right? I don't know. But an important part of this is I can only pray for something which could happen naturally. For example, say my child was in an automobile accident and he lost his arm. I am forbidden to pray to God that his arm should be restored, because arms never grow back. It is forbidden, according to the Jewish tradition, to pray for a miracle. You are not allowed because it won't happen. You can only pray for things that could happen naturally. And therefore, this is an essence of our prayer. We turn to God, we believe in God, we hope that God will help, but we never ever know what will come up. But if something will not happen, it is forbidden to have petitionary prayer for that event. And I want to illustrate this with a little joke. Every talk should have a little joke in it. There was once an extremely pious man, a wonderful person, good to everybody, believes in God. There's no finer person on the face of this earth. But he got into serious financial difficulties. and he hoped he would win the lottery, and that would give him the money. When Templeton tries to win the lottery, and that would give him the money to solve his problems. And he prayed, and week after week, he never won the lottery. And he was such a fine person that the angels of heaven turned to God. And he says, look, he's such a wonderful person. Can't you arrange that he should win the lottery? And God responded, I'd love to arrange it, but the damn fool won't buy a lottery ticket. That's what prayer means to God. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nathan. Our second speaker is Yamina Bouguenaya, and she has a degree in physics, but now she works in the as director of the Receiving Nur Center.
Okay, thank you, both Scott and Nathan. I felt, and peace be upon you all, Assalamu alaikum. I felt the need, maybe you've seen me like typing and typing and typing, and I had to actually tell myself you can't say everything, because there are so many, the differences are in the subtleties, that's why it's not easy to articulate them. So, for instance, when I heard the gardener comparison, or the metaphor as you call it, I thought, well, but the gardener is very limited. And how can a limited gardener compare? How can we use that as a unit of measurement to think of anything related to God? And I thought, how does God describe himself to me? I'm again speaking about my understanding of the Islamic or the Quranic understanding of prayer. So from the Quran, if you look at even the literal meaning of the verses, it's repeated again and again that God knows everything. He knows everything in the universe and within ourselves, even our hidden thoughts and desires and wishes. And that he knows what goes through our hearts since he is, and he keeps saying, since I create you. And so the creator is not the creator at the beginning, he's the sustainer. Right now, I don't know how I am breathing. I am made to breathe. My life is being sustained here and now, always. And he knows the seen and the unseen, we are told. He's all hearing, all seeing, all aware. So there is this idea of God creating and sustaining life and everything all the time. And nothing other than him can create anything, since everything else, they are themselves created. And God creates with purpose and meaning, it is repeated. What is even more important, as far as prayer is concerned, is that he makes everything subservient to us. He created everything to our service. I think that's interesting. And we are told his mercy encompasses everything. Maybe you know that Muslims start everything in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. It's compassion and mercy are the most important attributes of God for Muslims. And is it a constraint? Sure, it is a constraint that he himself willed upon himself. So when I heard unmarried bachelor, I thought, that's a name we gave to a certain status that it has no external existence. Yes, there is someone God creates, but that person who calls it, defines it as bachelor or that is us. Okay, so that's on the side. And all these attributes of God we don't know them, or we may know them, we may get to know them at different levels, but the purpose of life is to get to know God. So it's a life journey. It's not like you know him all at once. So it's a hope. Now, the Quranic context of prayer is also very important. The supplication of human beings, well, first is everything prays to God. even the birds, even everything. And they glorify God all the time. And what does it mean? It means that their needs are being constantly being taken care of by God. And it's as though like a seed growing, as though the seed growing is like the seed needs to grow and it's in a state of praying to God. So, and the water and everything are participating in the supplication so that it grows. And the growing, as it grows and shows the beauty of the Creator, it is glorifying God and extolling His glory with His divine names. Now, when it comes to human being, there are two kinds of prayer generally. One is through action, what Nathan was talking about, and one is through action and disposition, the way we are. And the other one is the verbal that Scott was talking about, the petitionary one. So as Muslims, they say to plow a field is to knock at the door of the church of mercy. So when you're plowing your field, when you're doing something, the whole thing is about doing it with that spirit, with that mindfulness, the mindfulness that I am asking from God even when I'm going to the doctor, even when I'm taking my medicine. So having recourse to causes, like taking my medicine, let's say when I'm sick, is a supplication, is a prayer through action, and it is seeking the result from the Creator. So it's that mindfulness that is going to make it a prayer that has results in this life and in the next. The next life is very important for Muslims. It's a reality that we need to cultivate mindfulness of. And so I can do the same thing and say, I will pray after I exhaust all causes. For me, no. As I am, as Scott is looking for Andrew, that's part of the prayer. So it's the mindfulness that's going to make the difference. And so they are all at a certain level similar in the way that they are a calling unto God for help. And so that awareness that everything, all healing, whether through medicine or through prayers or through the combination of both, is from God. Like the outcome, I'm expecting the outcome from God. Or I know that the outcome is from God because everything, there is nothing, it says, show me who can create anything else. Everything is from God. These are verses from the Quran. So since He's the sole creator of everything, then He creates me when I'm healthy, He creates me when I'm sick, He creates me with my needs for health, and being the creator, He knows my needs, and unlike me, He knows what is best and most appropriate for me. Therefore, there is always reason for me to be grateful to God. I agree there with Scott. And according to this understanding, we're always in a state of prayer. But we may not be aware of it, in which case I won't benefit from the benefit of the prayer, that connection with the divine, here and now and forever. That connection of being the guest of a merciful host. So for instance, now I'm breathing, and my breathing is being sustained by my Creator right now. It's definitely not me who is doing it. So this breathing is also a kind of prayer. Therefore, each moment is prayer, and life itself is prayer. And when I'm sick and I take medicine, that goes hand in hand, and both kinds of prayers, through actions and through words, and being guided maybe to the right diagnosis, to the right medicine, to the right doctor, are all needs, and therefore they are all prayers. And the prayer may not be sincere. Prayer is not measurable. We can't measure because among Muslim scholars talk about conditions of acceptability for prayers to be accepted. And they mention that in some tradition, according to some traditions, that praying with a distracted heart, with a mindless heart, for instance, lowers the acceptability, the prayer, the factor of prayer being accepted. So how can you measure if the heart is mindful or not? For instance, So that sincerity is also makes a difference. So the atheist friend who sends positive energy, that's prayer. He may not know it, but from me, it is a prayer. But his prayer will only stay in this world, won't bear fruits after life. So the verbal prayers that Scott was specifically focusing on are our special requests from God when we are having a hard time, when we need something that's beyond our control, like in time of hardship, in time of sickness. However, ideally, we're supposed to be in that state of prayer prior to the crisis, during the crisis, while we are taking action, when nothing is going on. Everything is supposed to be done in that state of prayer. That's why mindfulness is very important, and the Quran keeps talking about do not remain mindless, because that's the worst thing that you could do. Now, the aim of prayer, we are told, is to worship God, to know and worship God. The need, the object of the prayer, in Scott's terminology, is an occasion for the prayer, not the goal. So from my perspective, God's creating corresponds to his meeting my needs all the time, and whether in times of crisis or not. And most of my needs are met anyways, like breathing, the most important ones. Most of the time I'm not even aware of them, and I don't need to ask for them. And that's why, and so because we take them for granted, and most of the time we are unaware, we are given some of our needs, we're left to our care. And those needs are through action, like feeding ourselves, for instance, and through calling for help in special occasions, in special moments. This way we are made to pause and realize how vulnerable, how fragile, how needy we are. And yet, most of our needs, most of the time, are mostly being taken care of. So that's a moment of realizing that I am being the recipient of much goodness. And so in moments of crisis that leads us to pray, they are opportunities for us to remember God as that source of mercy and generosity and sustaining. And so we open ourselves to know God through his sustaining us, and especially on this moment we feel it very intensely because we feel so helpless. And then we realize that God is near to us, as we are told in the Quran again and again, he is near to us. And most of the time we think he is far because we are far from him. So when we call unto him, we realize how accessible he is to us. And we are supposed to then keep that awareness and mindfulness all the time. And one of my personal prayers is, please, 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 I write everything, help me keep that mindfulness so I don't need as many crises as... There was a time when I had many, many crises, one top of each other, and when I understood in my own way, and I realized that that was the gist of surrendering, which is the term Islam, to surrender to God's will, then either it's not the same or my perception of it is not the same. In any case, I do not experience the reality in the same stressful way. It's much more peaceful now. So God does not need my prayers to tell him my needs. He knows, he creates. He already knows what I stand in need for. It's not like I'm reminding God of what to do, or I know how to take care of my needs, but I just need the power and the strength. That's not how prayer. We do that in our moments of mindlessness, but that's not how it's supposed to be from the perspective of the Quran, as I understand it. So, because that's not worship, that's like we are partnering. I know everything, I just need you to come and do the work. So he gave me, for instance, he gave me the need for water. That need, or for health, is given to me to connect to him, to get to know him, because it's through our vulnerability, our neediness, that we get to realize the sustainership of of God, of our Maker, of our Creator. So if I am very thirsty in the desert and I ask for water, where is water? Where is water? I don't know if you were very thirsty, but like in Ramadan, we stay like 17 hours without drinking. You start smelling water by the time it's sunset. So he gave me the need for water, and he created water. But if I remain stuck in the water itself, I want the water, he may give me the water, but I will never realize that there is something much more beautiful than the water. And this water, we are told in the hereafter, will not take care of your thirst. Because the water doesn't know, look, I can do whatever I want with it. It has no life, and yet it is employed in sustaining my life. So he says, do not get stuck in the water. Make water a mirror to divine mercy and generosity and giving of life, and that eternal source that will last here and always and forever, even after death, God willing. So that's my crisis, my need for the water is the time to remember God. My need for health is the time to remember God. It's not the time to ask solely for the health. It's not the goal is not the water. The water is an opportunity. It is a means, an occasion. And when it is given, it is like a signpost, like a mirror, reflecting the divine attributes of mercy and generosity and helping and sustaining us. I want to just share a few verses from the Quran. We are told there are people who merely pray, "O our sustainer, give us in this world, and such shall not partake in the blessings of the life to come. But there are among them such as pray, "O our sustainer, grant us good in this world and good in the life to come." Isn't that good? To be on the safe side? But of course, this is not only a prayer of the tongue. This is a prayer of a state of being. It has to come from the heart. It's a state of surrender to this reality. And keep us safe. It is these that shall have their portion of happiness in return for what they have earned. And God is swift in reckoning. We are also told in the Quran, no one can withhold the blessings of God, the blessings that God opens for people, nor can anyone but him release whatever he withholds. He's almighty, the all-wise. O people, remember God's grace towards you. Is there any creator other than God to give you sustenance from the heavens and earth? There is no God except him. How can you be so deluded? O people, it is you who stand in need of God, whereas he alone is self-sufficient, the one to whom all praise is due. And the most famous ones about prayer, we are told, if my servants ask you about me, behold, say, I am near, I am close. I respond to the call of him who calls whenever he calls unto me. Let them then respond unto me and believe in me so that they might follow the right way. And in another verse we are told, but your sustainer says, call unto me and I shall respond to you. It is God who has made the night for you so that you might rest therein, and the day in order for you to see. Behold, God is indeed limitless in his grace unto people, but most people are ungrateful. Such is God, your sustainer, the creator of all that exists. There is no deity except him. How can you be so deluded? Again, in another place. So here, when God says, call me and I shall respond to you, it means he always answers, and this was pointed to before. So he responds, he answers, but he does not necessarily give me what I want. The example is the sick child who wants banana flavor syrup, for instance. And it may be that's not what he needs in this case. Maybe he needs nothing. He just needs to rest. Or maybe he needs something better. So we don't know. And when we surrender, when we know God and trust Him and surrender to Him, then we are more willing to accept and listen. How is He answering our prayers? So the trust comes. So although we can't know for sure, trust, the last point was, and surrender and have faith is very important. And this faith in Islam is based on evidences that I collect during my interaction with God in the world and getting to know Him as the merciful, generous, and all-knowing, etc., which is the main tenet of Islam, the Shahada, the testimony, based on the witnessing and observation of evidences in the world. We are also told, worship God alone, you have no deity other than Him. He brought you into being out of the earth and made you thrive thereon. Ask Him, therefore, to forgive you your sins and then turn towards Him in repentance. For truly, my sustainer is ever near, responding to the calls of whoever calls unto Him. There are two types of prayers that I thought. Can I go with the two types very quickly? Jonah and Job? Okay. But the Jonah and Job stories, they are told in the Quran, they embody this attitude, their prayers. And so the type A and type B, here, they're totally different types. They're complementary, actually. And they are usually taught to be recited together. Okay, so do I have like 2 minutes for a poem of Rumi? Rumi. He says, prayer is an egg. On resurrection day, God will say, what did you do with the strength and energy your food gave you on earth? How did you use your eyes? What did you make with your 5 senses while they were dimming and playing out? I gave you hands and feet as tools for preparing the ground for planting. Did you, in the health I gave you, do the plowing? You will not be able to stand when you hear those questions. You will bend double and finally acknowledge the glory. God will say, lift your hand and answer the questions. Your head will rise a little, then slump again. Look at me. Tell, what have you done? You try, but you fall back flat as a snake. I want every detail. Say, eventually, you will be able to get to a sitting position. Be plain and clear. I have given you such gifts. What did you do with them? You turn to the right, looking to the prophets for help, as though to say, I'm stuck in the mud of my life. Help me out of this. They will answer those kings, the time for helping is past. It's the day of judgment. The plow stands there in the field. You should have used it. Then you turn to the left where your family is, and they will say, don't look at us. This conversation is between you and your Creator. Then you pray the prayer that is the essence of every ritual. God, I have no hope. I am torn to shreds. You are my first and last and only refuge. Don't do daily prayers like a bird pecking, moving its head up and down. Prayer is an egg. Hatch out the total helplessness inside.
Thank you very much, Scott. Nathan, Yamina. We've really been stimulated. I know there's going to be some questions. I'm going to ask questions from the community people. Our scholars have been together all week, and they'll get a chance to quiz them more. But we'll take the questions. The program manager, Kyle Coyers, will pass the mic around on that side. And you have your mic. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So who wants to be first? Okay.
A question for Scott. what would be your answer to Nathan's answer to the amputee situation? We have probably thousands of soldiers coming back from the war. You have probably tens of thousands of people who one way or another lose arms, legs. It's not a matter that they all don't get them back through prayer or any other means. It's that none of them do. If I don't know of any that have ever had a regrown an arm or a leg. So the Jewish answer was, we're forbidden to pray for these. What about the Christian answer for that?
I'm not really an expert, but I don't think there's any prohibition on praying for a miracle. I don't see that in the Christian tradition. Would I recommend that somebody pray for a miracle? That's a tough question. I don't know. I mean, I think that's what Nathan said was that you're setting yourself up for disappointment because it's not going to happen.
No, you're forbidden to pray for a miracle.
Because it's not going to happen.
No, just not because it's not going to happen, because God doesn't do this, and you're forbidden to ask for God for something which is against the way He operates in this world. God operates within the laws of nature.
I don't know if I answered your question.
Another one. Okay.
Hi, Scott. Thanks a lot for your talk. I have a question here. If it's the case that we have no good reason to believe that the reasons to which we have access are representative of the reasons that God has access to, so God works in mysterious ways. He has reasons that, for all we know, we don't have access to. Are we, as a matter of principle, cut off from knowing that any particular prayer was effective, or is there some other, perhaps, other access that we might have to knowing whether any particular prayer was actually effective? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know how to answer it in a simple way because there's so many different kinds of cases, and it depends a lot on what kind of threshold you impose for knowing the answer to this question. Is it possible that God could somehow reveal to us that He answered a prayer short of a burning bush kind of situation? I think that's a really good question. I don't have a short, pithy answer to that. But I think in general, I think in the book I talk about this, it's very hard to argue that we know in particular cases whether our prayers have been answered, even when the things we ask for come to pass. And I think what you mentioned about the reasons it's one of the main arguments there. So I'm inclined to say it would be very unusual for a person to know. I hope that helps.
Okay, next question.
I think Scott's curve was a Cupid's curve or something like that, with the label anyway. Yeah. So continuum of trust and faith. Right. And just in medicine, our ideas of curing and healing, probabilities, high probability things are where surgeons like to be. That's why Nathan's surgeon wants to take credit for all that happened on the case. He doesn't like that he had uncertainty. And a lot of surgery, we try to be in very high probability of a good outcome. We don't like 50-50 odds. We like very long odds where it's likely it's going to turn out well. My thought is that in the other end, where it's low probability of good outcome, is the area where hope and trust and faith are most important. To have faith or hope or something when it's high probability, that's pretty easy. Everybody agrees on this. That's a matter of belief. But if you have hope, I think that's where we are in the continuum. If you come into critical care, you're sort of down at possibly the low probability part. And even though we're not sure what the external prayers did, we know a nurse touching you, bathing you, putting you, that's the beginning of prayers for your outcome, and you respond to that. And we've seen when love, and this is where praying to God, I would assume, and hoping for a response, confers some peace, white counts rise, high blood pressures fall. There are physical responses when you come to peace and are, so somewhere clearly that prayer is being answered in almost every case that we experience. And so I just think that that idea anyways is that you can actually shift the probability of your recovery. The more you put your life in the hands of God and the caregivers and your loving family. Yeah,
that's interesting. I took a slide out about a case in which the person's prayer, just in virtue of being offered, makes a difference. And there are, of course, all kinds of benefits for the person who prays. We have lots of studies about this, that praying, for people of faith anyway, praying improves their conditions in lots of ways, certainly. That there's no question about that. And whether you want to say that that's a prayer that's answered by God, in my sense, it would still be unclear to me, because there's a clear mechanism in virtue of which we can see that the praying itself leads to those changes, you know. But certainly that's an important benefit of prayer that needs to be emphasized as well.
My question is about the relationship between petitionary prayer and community. It seems that your two types of prayer, A and B, thy will or what I want, if we have all kinds of people praying for a Category 5 hurricane not to hit there where they live, but to go over there, then we're in conflict between my own desires and the desires of the community.
Yeah, that's right. Or in the Super Bowl. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I didn't talk about the communal dimension to prayer. In my book, I restrict myself to an individual petitioner, but when you add a community, it changes things a lot. It's an interesting dimension, the difference. Yeah, and sometimes people do pray for things that could be answered only if somebody else suffers, and so you sort of feel like that's not the right way to pray, right? I mean, that's kind of a puzzle, a problem. Yeah, it's a good point. And the difference between a group and an individual is important too, and I didn't have time to talk about that.
Okay.
Hi, I'd like to talk about the partnering that was mentioned between what we do and what God does. And seeing as water was brought up just recently in the bottle there, I want to mention that Nestle pumps our groundwater, our common resource, about an hour north, and sells it back to us in plastic as Ice Mountain. And also we have fracking going on in Michigan, which can pollute our water. And we have this pipeline under the bridge that's 67 years old, carrying oil, and it could break anytime. And so what is our role in caring for creation and partnering with God? Or do we just pray for no pollution? Or do we pray for, oh, fix this pollution problem we caused? Anyway, any comments?
Well, I would like to actually comment on that. It says in the beginning of Genesis that God gave us our planet to enjoy it and to guard it and to watch it. We have a divine commandment to take care of this earth. It is for us to use and enjoy under the condition that we are taking care of it. And if a person does violence to this planet, he is violating the commandments of God.
It's very similar in the Islamic tradition. We are sent on earth, Adam and the humankind was sent as representative of God, and so everything is entrusted. It's a trust, it's not ours. Life is a trust, the whole planet is a trust. So I would say, personally, I would start doing those steps in my personal life, and however much I can be involved, that will be, my prayer will be not only words, but also action, because I cannot, from my understanding, prayer is always, if it is sincere, if it is not just lip service, then it's going to involve some action in the world. And we are told in the Quran that the earth and the oceans will be polluted because of your wrongdoing. So be careful. Like that time, they probably didn't know that if you're careless, you're going to pollute everything. But it says there is a verse about pollution, for instance. So it is a responsibility.
Just for an advertisement, since Scott has so blatantly done so for his book. Actually, the California Interfaith Institute is getting involved with an interfaith approach to creation care. So follow us on our website and you'll learn more about it. Next question.
For Scott, a possible avenue to pursue with respect to the problem that C.S. Lewis posed with the A pattern and B pattern. It seems that the problem assumes that in a particularly tricky situation that God only wills that one thing be the case. And if it were the case that God had willed a certain set of options, then it seems like you could do both. God's will be done, and what I would like to be done of these willed options would be this one here. I know it needs to be fleshed out, but maybe there's something there.
That's a creative suggestion. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, next.
I'm grateful to be with you as you are three representatives of aspects of the Abrahamic faith. Shared among you all is the idea of prayer. And prayers are things unseen. Our belief in things unseen is faith. What ideas do your three traditions carry about what happens to prayer once it is formed in our bodies, in our minds? Is there thought that prayer leaves the body in some way? Or is it always perceived by the divine within our bodies?
I don't know what the Christian tradition says about the prayer as an object like that. I tend to think of the prayer as an action, rather than a thing that has a location myself. And so in the same way that what I'm saying to you now doesn't have a location, but it's a thing that's somehow communicated across the space. But we might think of the effects of the prayer as remaining in your body, and some also leaving your body in some sense, and ending up somewhere else, maybe in God's action. So I think there are a lot of ways to think about that from my point of view.
From my point of view, the prayer is not, the word is just an articulation at the last articulation of the prayer. So the prayer is a desire, a state of being, a state of mindfulness. That's why sometimes we say something and we don't get it, because actually in our heart we're stuck in somewhere else, or our real prayer is something else. We're confused, we're not clear. And so since God creates us, the majority Muslim theologians, not all of them, the majority, and I subscribe to that belief that God sustains us here and now. The name sustainer is one of the most repeated in the Quran. So he sustains us here and now. So he is creating me with my need and with my desire and with my prayer. So he does not need the prayer to go and come. It's my understanding. It's coming from my perspective. Where does the prayer go? It's a metaphor that I use in my limited semantics, but there is somewhere beyond where words don't work.
I think that's a marvelous question. And we have an idea in Orthodox Judaism, from my point of view, that when I pray for health, I don't have to tell God what I need. I don't have to tell God what my problems are. He's sick and tired of hearing me tell him what my problems are. I pray for myself. I pray for health in order to make sure I understand that my health ultimately comes from God. I pray for sustenance in order that I should be more aware that my sustenance comes from God. So my prayers never leave my body. My prayers are for me, and they make me a better person because they increase my faith. So if my prayers are answered in some way, it's because I've been transformed through my prayers, and I am more worthy of having my prayers answered. The prayers are for me, not for God.
Okay, we have some announcements about lunch and things, but we have one final question.
Actually, not a question, just a couple of quick comments. Just wanted to add to what Yamina said about the Islamic concept of prayer, especially with respect to the answerability of them. She touched on the fact that a person's state of heart can influence the likelihood of a prayer being answered by God. So some of these teachings come from prophetic teachings from the Prophet Muhammad as opposed to some of the Quranic teachings that she mentioned. But we have teachings that say that if a person doesn't pay attention to the lawfulness of their income and their food and their drink and their clothes, know that they're not living the way that God wants them to, how could they expect God to answer their prayers? There is the teaching that if there's also reasons to think that some prayers are more likely to be answered. And that's if you're persistent in your prayer. God loves people who are persistent in their prayer. People who are very faithful and trusting and expecting a response from God. That actually is going to promote God answering your prayer. And people who are desperate, or people who are oppressed in particular. The prophet said, beware of someone who, the prayer of a person who's oppressed. In other words, beware if they're praying God, invoking God, against potentially you if you're the oppressor, because there's no barrier between the prayer of an oppressed and God. And then finally, assuming you've met some of these conditions, so there's conditions for a prayer to be answered by God. If you meet those conditions and you pray sincerely to God, then God will answer it, but in potentially different ways. So one way is that he might respond promptly in this life, or he might delay the response based on his wisdom or mercy in the afterlife. So you might have asked for certain things and you never got it in this world, and then you find out in the afterlife that God saved those prayers and he rewarded you for them. And you might wish that he never answered any of your prayers in the world and he just saved it all up for later. And then finally, he might avert certain harms that might be equivalent to the thing that you had asked for. So you might not get it, but he will avert certain harms. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay, thank you.
Very helpful, thank you.
Thank you, all the Templeton participants who have been here. I know you'll get a chance when you go back to Kalamazoo to discuss this further. Thank you so much, Scott and Yamina and Nathan, for your part. Before we recognize all that and depart, there are some announcements about lunch. Those of you that purchase lunch should have a ticket. Use your ticket to pick up your lunch. There's a variety of styles there. And if you didn't purchase a lunch and you want to stay, the afternoon sessions are going to be wonderful. I think you know that. And if you want lunch, there's lunch available nearby. Program manager Kyle Coyers will have some details.
So as Doug said, we only have lunches available for folks that have tickets. So if you have tickets or you're with Kelly's group from Kalamazoo, you can head on out to the right. You'll see all the lunches there. Katie Gordon, our other program manager, will be there to assist you. If you have any questions about where to find lunch, if you don't have tickets, I will be at the table to the right of the door. There are some places in walking distance just down Michigan to the west, and I can talk to you more about that. So thank you.
All right, you can pick up your lunch. You can take it to your meeting room, bring it back in here. And thank you again, speakers, and everyone else for your participation.